CEO Richard Clarke was having a normal evening at his sprawling country home in England. As usual, he finished a long day at work and retired to his ensuite bathroom. However, something unusual happened. As he looked in the mirror while washing his face, something peculiar caught his eye. There, in a corner of the bathroom, was a strange miniature, a scaled-down figure, perfect in detail, and which immediately caught his attention as a replica of himself. The miniature was too perfect, with the same expensive clothes, the same penetrating gaze, and the same posture. Richard froze. The question that popped into his mind was automatic but terrifying. Could it be my son? He had never known of any lost or unknown children, and yet that miniature seemed to reveal something deeper. A feeling of fear and mystery gripped his mind. How did it get there? Why was it exactly in his bathroom? And most importantly, who could have done something like this? Richard tries to ignore the miniature and rationalize what could be happening. It could be a piece of art or a prank by a friend, but the coincidence of it being a miniature of himself in his bathroom messed with his mind. He feels there's something more at stake, and perhaps a hidden secret he didn't yet know about his life. Richard Clarke is a successful man, but his success comes at a high price. He is immersed in the corporate world, where ethics are often lost amidst the pursuit of power and money. At 45, he is a lonely man, married to his career and with few real connections. His wife, Helena, has always been in the shadow of his ambition, and their relationship, although still functional, is distant and weakened by the absence of genuine communication. The miniature in the bathroom isn't just a strange object. It's the catalyst that forces Richard to question everything he's taken for granted in his life. As someone who has always controlled every aspect of his existence, he never imagined that something so mysterious and beyond his control could emerge. When he reflects on his life, he begins to remember fragments of a past he had suppressed. He was never truly present for Helena or anyone else. His life, though full of material achievements, was never filled with the emotional bonds that truly matter. Meanwhile, Helena, a calm and reserved woman, also carries her own secrets. She knew more about Richard's history than he imagined. Over the years, she watched her husband become emotionally distant, but a part of her still harbored a blind hope that one day he might change. She didn't know the miniature, but her own mystery was beginning to unravel as Richard's inner conflict grew. Her past, like his, was full of unresolved questions and unspoken moments. The story is set in an isolated mansion in rural England, far from the city. The country house, with its antique and elegant furniture, reflects Richard's own nature, imposing yet cold and empty. The place has an atmosphere of solitude, with long corridors and closed doors that seem to hide more than just objects and furniture. He always felt comfortable there, but now, after the encounter with the miniature, Richard begins to see the house in a different way, as if the walls were beginning to whisper secrets. The country, England, also exerts a subtle influence on the characters. Tradition, social hierarchy, and rigid behavioral patterns are factors that have shaped Richard's life. But now, confronted with something he cannot control or explain, he begins to question his own identity. His family's heritage, with its blood ties and long-buried secrets, begins to surface. With the miniature in hand, Richard can no longer ignore the feeling that something is wrong. He begins to investigate where the figure might have come from, searching the house and trying to understand if one of the employees placed it there as a kind of joke. However, no one admits to knowing its origin. The tension within Richard grows each day, and he begins to question his past in a way he never had before. The central conflict arises when Richard, after a sleepless night, begins to reminisce about his past relationships. He remembers a business trip to Japan more than 10 years ago, where he had a brief, instinctive romance with a woman named Yumi. What began as a fleeting adventure turned into a nightmare when Richard, upon returning to England, never had contact with her again. The idea of having a lost child from a past romance begins to take shape in his mind. However, he is not sure that Yumi or any other woman could be the mother of the child he now imagines. As time passes, he begins to feel paranoid, as if he were being watched. He starts to question whether his wife, Helena, knows anything about it. But what torments him most is the idea that perhaps he was responsible for hiding the truth from himself. He begins to suspect that the miniature is a message from someone, perhaps his own son, asking him to recognize him. The conflict intensifies when one night, arriving home late from work, Richard finds Helena with a tense expression. She observes him with a look that mixes distrust and sadness, as if she knows something has changed in him. Throughout dinner, he feels a growing emptiness. He tries to talk, but each word sounds distant without a genuine response. Communication between them, which had always been cold, now seems impossible. The miniature continues to be the center of Richard's obsession, and he begins to believe that something supernatural is involved. He starts to think that the miniature is not just a physical replica of himself, but a metaphor for his own fragmented life. He finds himself trapped in a cycle of reflection and obsession as he tries to piece together a puzzle that, until then, he had never even realized existed. As Richard tries to unravel the mystery of the miniature, subplots begin to intertwine and add layers to the main conflict. The tension between him and Helena reaches a critical point when she begins to realize that something is wrong. Despite her attempts to maintain the facade of a stable marriage, she feels Richard is drifting further away. She doesn't know exactly what's happening, but she realizes that his obsession with the miniature is changing his personality and his worldview. Helena begins to wonder if the mystery is deeper than Richard imagines, or if he's simply creating drama to escape something bigger and more painful. Helena's subplot becomes more relevant as she decides to act on her own. She begins investigating the miniature's origins, searching for clues in books, old documents, and even among family friends who might have information about Richard's past. During this search, she discovers that Richard has a story he never told her, a story of a possible lost son, something he always avoided discussing. The revelation that Richard had an affair with Yumi during a business trip is a key turning point. Helena, already sensing a disconnect in her marriage, begins to question whether Richard's son is real or if he is merely projecting his own insecurities. Meanwhile, Richard continues his obsessive search for the truth, unaware that in trying to discover more about the miniature, he is distancing himself even further from Helena. His paranoia grows, and he begins to consider that perhaps someone within his own household placed the miniature there to provoke his emotions. He suspects his employees, but no one proves guilty. The real culprit, he begins to realize, may be himself, his inability to face the truth and his own failings. The complexity increases when Richard decides to visit his parents' old house in an attempt to find some clue about his childhood. There, he finds an old box containing letters and photos he had forgotten. Among these memories is a photo of a young Japanese woman smiling next to a baby, and Richard realizes that baby could be him. The revelation that the mother of Richard's possible child might be Yumi is the turning point for the protagonist, who begins to question everything he believed about his identity and his past. Helena, in turn, also faces her own dilemmas. She begins to wonder if she was merely a convenient choice for Richard, someone he married due to social and family pressure, but without truly loving her. The search for the truth about the miniature also forces her to confront her own repressed emotions. She feels she is losing herself amidst Richard's identity crisis and begins to ponder her own happiness. Could she leave an empty marriage and start over, or is her love for Richard still strong enough to withstand this emotional turmoil? The turning point comes when Richard, during a sleepless night, finally decides to confront his wife. He can no longer hide what he feels, a whirlwind of emotions mixing anger, confusion, and regret. He knew something had changed between them, but now, with the miniature in his hands, he believes the truth is within his grasp. The problem is, he doesn't know what the truth is. He calls her into the living room, where the silence of the house is overwhelming. Helena enters, but something in the air seems different. Richard notices she is calmer than usual, perhaps already knowing what he's about to say. He reveals his obsession with the miniature and the idea that he might have a lost child. To his surprise, Helena doesn't react with the anger or distrust he expected. Instead, she remains calm, almost resigned. "I know, Richard," she says, her words carrying more weight than any accusation. "I know about Yumi." The revelation hits him like a bombshell. Richard is paralyzed. He never imagined Helena knew about his affair with Yumi, much less that she knew about a possible child. He tries to protest, but Helena interrupts him. "You think I didn't know? I saw the way you changed when you came back from that trip. I knew there was something more, and I saw the picture of the child." She takes a photo from her desk drawer and places it on the table in front of him. The photo shows a child with Asian features, and Richard immediately recognizes the spot. He knew, somehow, that this was Yumi's son. However, the truth is not yet fully revealed. Helena, in an almost frightening calm, reveals something even more surprising. She knew he was distant, but never had the courage to question to what extent their relationship was based on a marriage without true love. She reveals that in recent months she had been considering divorce, but hesitated, fearing the consequences of a breakup. It is at this moment that Richard has an important revelation. He begins to realize that the miniature was not just a symbol of his lost son. It was also a reflection of his own life, a replica, a distorted reflection of himself. His obsession with his own image and his past blinded him to what really mattered in his life, his relationship with Helena and his capacity for change. Helena, noticing Richard's gradual transformation, makes a similarly radical decision. She decides not to follow the path of resignation and passivity. Instead, she confronts him directly, challenging him to change. "If you really want to be a different man, you'll have to act now, and if you can't, then please go away." The tension between them reaches its peak. Richard finds himself at a crossroads: confront the truth about his past and the man he has become, or continue to live in the illusion that the miniature version of himself in the bathroom is the only thing that matters. Following Helena's revelation, Richard begins to face the consequences of his own actions in a way he never imagined. The impact of his obsession with the miniature and the search for the truth about his possible lost son begin to affect every aspect of his life. He can no longer ignore the flaws in his marriage, nor the emptiness that has accumulated within him over the years. The tension between him and Helena reaches a new level. Although he has apologized and shown a willingness to change, something deep has broken between them. Helena, her patience exhausted, begins to distance herself emotionally. She no longer looks at Richard the same way. She loved him, but now she realizes that perhaps that love was based on an idealized version of him, someone she never truly knew. Richard, for his part, desperately tries to recover what was lost, but his attempts are in vain. He begins to realize that he cannot change the past, and that his selfish actions, his obsession, and his lack of connection with Helena have made him unrecognizable even to himself. He feels an immense weight, not only for his mistakes, but for the feeling that it is already too late to correct everything. Over time, Richard begins to pay more attention to what truly matters: his family's legacy. He returns to his parents' house, where he seeks answers about his past. There he finds more documents and letters that shed light on the truth about Yumi and the son he never knew he had. He discovers that the woman he loved and whom he had left behind now lives with a man who cares for her son, who, coincidentally, shares the same name as Richard. Helena, meanwhile, makes a crucial decision. She begins to re-evaluate her own life. Free from the distractions and burden of a troubled marriage, she gives herself permission to seek happiness outside of what she has always known. She starts to focus on her career and her own well-being, and in doing so, realizes that she should never have waited for Richard to change in order to feel complete. The distance between the two only grows. The idea of reconciliation is set aside as they both follow their own paths of self-discovery. For Richard, the consequences of his obsession with miniatures and the pursuit of truth are profound. He begins to see life in a clearer, but also more bitter way. He realizes that the relentless pursuit of perfection and control only distanced him from the things that truly mattered. While Helena rebuilds herself, Richard finds himself in a process of emotional isolation. The miniature, once a symbol of his lost past, now becomes a constant reminder of the man he ceased to be. The man who somehow destroyed his own life by getting lost in his own illusions. From the moment Richard finds himself truly alone, something inside him begins to change, no longer because of Helena, nor because of his supposed lost son, but because of himself. He had never had to confront his own identity in such a raw way. The miniature, once an object of obsession, is now an uncomfortable mirror of everything he has avoided for years. His vanity, his emotional detachment, and his inability to acknowledge his own flaws. Determined not to repeat the patterns that brought him to this point, Richard decides he needs to rebuild his life from scratch. He begins with small steps, abandoning his inflexible and controlled routine. For the first time in years, he takes a break from his corporate life. His voluntary departure from the company is met with surprise by everyone. He was always known as the tireless CEO, willing to sacrifice everything for success. Now, however, he admits to his directors that he needs time. During this period, he begins therapy, something he would have considered a weakness in the past. In therapy, he discovers how much his childhood was shaped by his father's impossible expectations, who saw material success as the only measure of worth. There, he begins to confront the true origin of his obsession with control. Richard gradually comes to recognize that his emotional detachment was not a result of coldness, but of fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of repeating his father's mistakes. Fear of connecting deeply and being rejected. The miniature then comes to symbolize not a lost child, but Richard himself as a child, trying to fit into an impossible mold. Meanwhile, his relationship with Helena evolves quietly. They are not together, but they are not enemies either. In rare meetings to discuss pending matters, Richard notices that she is different, lighter, more confident, happier. He observes her with a mixture of sadness and admiration. She has managed to move on, and in a way, this inspires him. He finally understands that loving someone doesn't always mean possessing them. Sometimes it means liberating them, including himself. During his days of reflection, Richard decides on something that will change his life: to travel to Japan and reunite with Yumi. Not to try to repair the past, but to close it with dignity. He needs answers. But above all, he needs to ask for forgiveness, not only from her, but from the young Richard within him, who has always carried guilt and abandonment. Upon arriving in Japan, he finds Yumi at a small coffee shop where she works. The reunion is tense, but not hostile. Yumi observes him calmly, but her eyes hold stories he cannot decipher. Richard apologizes without justification, without masks, without defenses. He speaks of fear, of his childhood, of how he lost himself. Yumi listens to everything in silence. Then, with a serenity that destroys Richard inside, she reveals the truth he never expected. The boy is not his son. The miniature, which he believed to be a clue, was merely a coincidence. The photo Helena found was from a charity event, not a secret family. The child, although similar, had no blood relation to him. Yumi clarifies that she never became pregnant and that her life took a completely different path. The impact is devastating and liberating at the same time. His entire journey, the pain, the obsession, the fear, had been built on a mistaken assumption. But at that moment, he understands that the true lesson wasn't in fatherhood, but in the process of confronting himself. The miniature never meant a son, it always meant him. Richard returns to England with a maturity he never thought he would achieve. He decides to transform the company, become a more humane leader, reshape internal policies, and create psychological support programs for employees. For the first time, he thinks about others. Not because it improves his image, but because he now sees everyone with more empathy. His personal growth is evident in small actions. He starts visiting his parents, helping his sister, and participating in community activities. Not because he needs to show kindness, but because he finally feels the desire to be a better person. Helena observes these changes from a distance, surprised but not deluded. She knows that her path and Richard's will probably never cross again as before. But she also recognizes that he is now a different man, and that brings peace to them both. Richard's recovery isn't dramatic or miraculous. It's quiet, gradual, and profoundly human. And for the first time in years, he looks at his reflection, a real one, in the bathroom mirror, and feels no shame. Richard's story is now at a turning point. After confronting his flaws and growing as a person, he begins to prepare for the biggest change of all, a climax that will bring either the resolution of everything he has learned or the complete loss of everything. The decision to take control of his life and his corporate legacy has never been more important. Richard's journey of self-discovery begins to intertwine with a professional decision. After a series of changes within the company, he begins to implement a radical reform that challenges industry conventions. He decides that, instead of continuing in the rigid corporate world he has built, he will embrace a new approach, one that values employee well-being, promotes collaboration, and social purpose. However, his choices are not well received by everyone. A major investor who holds a majority stake in the company vehemently opposes the proposed changes. He pressures Richard to reverse his decisions, offering a large sum of money to revert to his former business approach. The financial pressure and the threat of losing control of the company force him into a conflicted position. On one side is the financial investment he has always prioritized, and on the other, the mission of rebuilding the company in a more humane and sustainable way. At this point, Richard begins to realize how far he has come on his journey of personal transformation. He is no longer the man obsessed with control and power. He is, in fact, ready to make the difficult choice. The decision to embrace true transformation or succumb to financial pressure while maintaining his status quo will define his future. He begins to think about Yumi, about Helena, about the son who was never his, and about the legacy he truly wants to leave for the world. Despite the intense pressure on him, he finally begins to break free from his old materialistic worldview. Richard realizes that his true miniature is a reflection of the choices he makes now. He can no longer live to please others or to maintain a facade of success. What he chooses now will be the true test of his transformation. Meanwhile, Helena continues her life on a separate path, but still follows the situation from afar. She feels that Richard's fate is somehow linked to her own growth. She knew that eventually he would have to make the choice to renounce what is easy in favor of what is true. Although their relationship has broken down, the respect she feels for him now grows. This is Richard's moment. The tension between the values he now holds and the pressure to maintain power and money reaches its peak. The decision he makes here will not only define his professional future, but will also be the ultimate test of his true inner transformation. The story's grand climax occurs when Richard finally faces the deepest dilemma of his life. Should he succumb to financial pressure and regain control of his company, as everyone expects of him? Or should he embrace the transformation he has experienced and follow the more challenging but more honest path? This decision culminates in a crucial meeting with the major investor, who pressures Richard to accept an offer that would guarantee his status and financial security, but would also mean giving up all the reforms he had planned for the company. Richard, for a moment, feels the old temptation, the power of money, absolute control, recognition. He could return to the top and reinforce the facade of success he's always had. But looking at the investor and listening to his empty words about what's best for business, something inside Richard breaks. He closes his eyes for a moment and remembers the lessons he learned throughout the story, the miniature that made him question his own identity, the conversations with Helena, the days of reflection, the discoveries of his past, the encounter with Yumi, and above all, the freedom he found in facing his own fears and flaws. Richard looks at the investor and in a calm but firm voice replies, "This business is no longer worth anything to me. What matters is the future of the company, the people who work there, and the impact we can have on the world. I can no longer live in fear of losing what I already have. I choose what is right, not what is easy." The investor, surprised and furious, tries to pressure him once more, offering one last cash bid. But Richard stands firm. He refuses, deciding to sell most of his stake to invest in a new vision for the company, which will become an organization focused on employee well-being, social impact, and sustainable practices. Richard goes further, inviting his directors to participate in the change, creating a new corporate culture where empathy, respect, and collaboration will be the pillars of success. However, the real twist comes when Richard discovers something even more shocking. During the meeting, the investor, in his anger, reveals a startling truth. The lost son Richard believed to be his never existed. The story of the miniature was not a foreshadowing of fatherhood, but an allegory for Richard's life, the quest for control, the obsession with something that could not be possessed, and the absence of true human connection. The miniature was placed there by one of the company's employees as a provocation to make Richard question his life and choices. The person who placed it knew of Richard's insecurities and, understanding his obsession with perfection and control, used this as a way to force him to confront his own fear and emptiness. Richard, upon understanding this, feels a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth, in all its brutality, liberates him from something he didn't even know was holding him captive. The revelation doesn't change his decision. He's ready to move forward, free from the shackles of his past. He finally finds peace in accepting that the miniature never represented a lost son, but a reflection on his own life. By freeing himself from the past, he reconciles with who he truly is and who he wants to become. When the meeting ends, Richard leaves the room with the feeling that now, yes, he is in control, but a control no longer based on fear or greed. He is in control of his own life, his choices, and ultimately, his happiness. In doing so, he not only saves himself, but also redefines the future of his company and what he believes in. Richard's life takes a new turn after the climax. His decision to pursue the path of transformation, despite the difficulties and pressures, reveals that he has finally found the peace he sought, but this peace did not come without sacrifices. He did not win Helena back, but he learned to reconcile with himself, and that is more valuable than any superficial relationship or material success. Under his renewed leadership, the company begins to thrive in a different way. Richard, now more humane, invests in employee wellness programs, adopts more sustainable business practices focused on social impact, and the company culture becomes based on mutual respect and collaboration. The pressure from major investors is constant, but Richard remains firm in his convictions, challenging corporate market norms and showing the world that it is possible to succeed without sacrificing ethics and the well-being of all. He begins giving talks and sharing his journey with other entrepreneurs, inspiring others to rethink the true meaning of success. In his words, he no longer speaks of money or power as the greatest goals, but rather of legacy, connection, and personal growth. He finds new ways to positively impact the lives of those around him in ways he never imagined before. Meanwhile, Helena follows her own path. She finds happiness in her career, her friendships, and the process of self-discovery she has also experienced. She begins to understand that her love for Richard was not a mistake, but an important chapter in her life. Both, in different ways, heal. What they shared was important, but now it's time for each to move on their own journeys. The miniature, once the center of Richard's obsession, is now merely an object of reflection, kept in a corner of his house. He looks at it from time to time, remembering everything he learned, no longer an obsession, but a constant reminder of his transformation. He feels no anger or regret for having gone through it all, but rather gratitude, for it was this process that led him to become the man he is today. Several years later, Richard finds himself in a position of authority, but in a completely different way. His company has expanded globally, but his true fulfillment lies in the impact he has had on the lives of his employees and on society. He continues to dedicate himself to social causes, education, and well-being, and is recognized not only as a successful businessman, but as a compassionate and transformative leader. Helena, for her part, lives a tranquil, balanced life, surrounded by friends and at peace with herself. They both followed different paths, but now they both know that true transformation begins from within. If you connected with Richard's journey, his inner struggle, and his quest for transformation, share this story with your friends and followers. The journey of self-discovery is a universal experience, and we can all learn something about the value of true change and personal growth. Comment below with your reflections on what it truly means to change and what lesson you take from Richard and Helena's story. Don't forget to follow for more inspiring stories that help us understand that true transformation comes from within.